Good evening and welcome to our members and guests. My name is Emma Davidson and I'm the President of the Oxford and Cambridge Society in Malaysia. Thank you for joining us this evening. We are so honoured that Ukraine's ambassador to Malaysia, His Excellency Olexander Nechytaylo, has found time in his busy schedule during this incredibly difficult period to talk to us this evening. His Excellency has been the ambassador to Malaysia since July 2016 and is also the non-resident ambassador to the Philippines and Timor-Leste. Previous postings include Jakarta and Beijing, and he's fluent in Mandarin, English, and Ukrainian. Olexander Nechytaylo, welcome, and thank you so much for agreeing to speak to the Society.
Thank you very much for having me tonight. Good evening, everyone. It's a great opportunity to be able to share on the latest developments in content to reach out to the Malaysia, Cambridge and Oxford Society. Let me start by introducing probably with a short presentation about what's happening, about the history of my country, because I think it's important to understand the current events through the prism of the history, through the prism of the background of this conflict and generally of what's happening in part of the world. So let me try to do the screen sharing. All right. So the first question that I'm often asked before this crisis especially is where Ukraine is geographically located. Ukraine is in the geographical center of Europe, and we border Russia on our eastern side, Belarus on the north, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Moldova on the western side. Ukraine is quite a big country, but even when it comes to the name, there is often a confusion. Ukraine is often, the name of the country is used as the Ukraine, which is not correct. The accurate pronunciation and the accurate toponymic name is Ukraine. Then when it comes to the capital of Ukraine is the city of Kiev, not Kiev. The legend says that the city was founded 1,500 years old ago by a family of Vikings traveling from the north down south in the search of warmer and more fertile land. And the elder brother's name was Kiev, and that's how we got the name for our capital. In terms of landmass, Ukraine is quite a sizable country in Europe. It's a combined size of UK and Germany, and it's probably slightly less than twice the size of Malaysia. But in terms of population, we are not that big. We are only 44 million people. So a density of population in Ukraine is one of the lowest in Europe. The history of my country goes back centuries or even sometimes millennia. But some important milestones that I would like to highlight here is the year 988 when the Grand Duke of Vladimir bring Christianity into Kiev. Generally, Kiev was considered, and I think until now considered, to be the cradle of the Eastern European civilization. Then another very important point, the first Ukrainian constitution was written. And you have to also put things into the context. This was much earlier than the Constitution of the United States. This because they help to understand how the history, how the values of freedom and personal liberties are important for us as a nation, individually and collectively. In 1918, after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, Ukraine, along with other countries, former Russian territories, Finland and Poland, got independence according to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was signed by the Soviet representative Leo Trotsky at that time, the representatives of Ukraine and the respective countries, Poland and Finland. However, that independence was quite short-lived because of many reasons. And in 1918, later on, Ukraine was ran over by the Bolsheviks. And by 1921, Ukraine became part of the Soviet Union, which was later called the USSR. So Another important date for us, 1991, that's when Ukraine finally became independent, and last year we celebrated 30 years of our independence. So when Ukraine became independent, we inherited a lot of things from the USSR, including the third largest nuclear arsenal. We had thousands of nuclear warheads and intercontinental ballistic missiles. However, the vision for our country was that Ukraine should be a non-aligned, non-nuclear, independent and democratic nation. So in 1994, Ukraine was persuaded by the nuclear powers to join the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. And in order to do so, we have signed the 1994 memorandum on the security assurance that were provided by the nuclear powers, at that time the UK, Russia, United States. Later on it was joined by France. And according to this memorandum, Ukraine was shipping all the remaining nuclear missiles from its territory to Russia. And in exchange, those four countries were providing Ukraine with the affirmation to protect our sovereignty and territorial integrity. So unfortunately, 20 years later, in 2014, one of the signatories of that document, namely Russia, was the one who invaded Ukraine, illegally annexed Crimea, and started the proxy war in the south east of Ukraine. So for Ukraine, this war began not on the 24th of February this year, but it's been a long 8 years of conflict, so-called hybrid warfare that included many different aspects. But over the past 8 years, more than 10,000 of my compatriots were killed. Even before this escalation in February, we had 1.2 million of internally displaced persons, which was a big burden for the economy. However, we still managed to take care of all those people with our own resources. Hundreds of thousands of families were destroyed. And of course, one of the most prominent milestones of that conflict was the MH17, downing of MH17 by the Russian missile. We hope that the ongoing trial in The Hague that is going on as a result of the joint investigation team will result this year or perhaps next year with the verdict. There are few suspects who've been identified and the trial is ongoing. And Malaysia, of course, part of this joint investigation team effort. So one of the false narratives that was widely used by Russian propaganda previously, that it was so-called rebels or some kind of proxy fighters in Ukraine that were advocating the independence of southeastern parts of the country. But of course, it was Russian regular military units which were present in Ukraine since 2014. And of course, it became obvious on the 24th of February 2022 when Russia launched a full-fledged invasion against Ukraine. The result of this invasion, you can see in the media, the suffering, the enormous tragedies that it brought to the people of Ukraine is beyond any comprehension. On the early morning on the 24th, Ukrainians all across the country woke up with the siren, the airstrikes, and a lot of destruction, a lot of civilian infrastructure, a lot of civilian casualties were reported. So over the past 50 days of war, we are talking about 198 children killed in this conflict. Another 355 have been injured. In order to record all the crimes of the international humanitarian law, the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine has set up a special team, and they've been registering of the crimes committed by the invader of Ukraine. And later on, all this data, all this forensic expertise, and all testimonies of the witnesses will be used for the prosecution in the international court. The existing framework of the International Criminal Court and International Court of Justice perhaps will not be sufficient given the complexity and given the numbers of victims of this conflict. So Ukraine will be advocating establishment of the special tribunal for the crime, something like United Nations already done before in case of Rwanda in 1994 and in case of former Yugoslavia. So, but why the conflict, which is far away from Malaysia, is so important? What kind of implications it may have, and what kind of consequences the humankind can feel? So the first one, of course, it affects the global economy. The global logistics that was already disrupted because of the global pandemic now will have even more impact. It will be affected even more. The commodity prices will rise, and it will affect, of course, the most of all the developing countries, because Ukraine is one of the major exporters of sunflower, wheat, and other essential items for the food security. Here, if you look at the slide, you will see some numbers. And I think another very important aspect of this is, of course, how the war in Ukraine will affect the international world security system. Of course, the unprovoked invasion into Ukraine constitutes a clear violation of the international law, the United Nations Charter, and all the existing framework of the world security, which was created after the World War II. So when you talk about the long-term consequences, of course, you have to understand that this is going to be a prolonged effect, which will probably be felt in every member of the international community. So another very important implication of the war in Ukraine is, of course, the polarization that has been artificially, or I would say falsely, created by some narratives. Very often this conflict has been viewed through the rivalry between the West and those who oppose the so-called domination of the Western powers. We have to understand that we are not talking about taking sides here. We are talking about the sanctity of the international law. So by supporting Ukraine, by supporting international law and justice, we are supporting the existing international law, the basic principles of the international law. And the humankind, the international community reacts very strongly to the violation of the international law. We noticed that unprecedented economic and political sanctions were imposed on the invader. Some of the members of Russian diplomatic missions abroad were expelled. This is just a short summary. How many? Another important question that I often ask is why Malaysia should care about what's happening in Ukraine, because it's so far, and perhaps not everyone would be able to feel the effect. However, it's important again to understand that in a current interconnected world, when you talk about the major military conflict, that the largest probably after World War II, with so many casualties, with so many displaced persons, we are talking now about 11 million refugees in Ukraine, which is 7 million inside the country, so-called IDPs, another 4 million in Europe. So, of course, this kind of catastrophe will have a global impact. And first, and probably the shortest effect that everybody would feel is the increase of commodity prices, utility prices, inflation. And of course, when you talk about bigger things, it may affect Malaysia. You can talk about the regional implication for regional security. I'm often asked, how do you see the reaction of Malaysia officially and unofficially on this war in Ukraine? So we are very happy that Malaysia supported the United Nations General Assembly 2 resolutions on the 2nd of March, which is called aggression against Ukraine, and on the 24th of March, the humanitarian consequences of the aggression against Ukraine. These two international documents condemned very strongly the Russian invasion, and they call upon immediate withdrawal of the invaders and immediate ceasefire. We believe this is important because the unprecedented number of countries, 141 for the first resolution and 140 for the second one, shows that the world overwhelmingly deplores this act of aggression. Another important aspect of this war is how business reacts to the war. We believe it is immoral to continue to do business with the entities that are directly responsible for the massive crime against humanity against Ukraine, and therefore we call upon business community to stop or to reconsider, to suspend any business dealings with the aggressor. So I'm also quite happy as ambassador that a lot of companies in Malaysia looking at this situation very seriously. I don't want to take much of your time. I will just probably show some of the images, most speaking images, I would say, how important it is to react on what's going on. And yeah, I think that's, I stop sharing.
Okay.
How important it is not to stay, not to be, you know, on the side, but to get involved and to understand that we're talking about the common values. We are talking about democracy. We are talking about the things that are fundamental for the world. So now I think it's better if we move to the Q&A session so that we can probably clarify certain things or answer any of your questions that you may have. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you for that presentation. Yeah, you definitely covered some of the areas we were going to ask questions about, and we've already had a question from the audience, and you kind of touched on that. And in the Q&A, maybe we can explore a little bit more. So for the questions, we're joined by Elizabeth Lee, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Sunway Education Group and the past president of the Oxford and Cambridge Society in Malaysia. And we'll also be joined later on by Faisal Arif, who is the founder and CEO of Border Pass, and he's our current secretary of the Oxford and Cambridge Society. So I'll pass you over to Elizabeth. Just to remind everybody who's watching, please do type your questions in the chat and then we'll put them forward to the team. All right, so over to Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, Madam President Emma, and good evening to you, Ambassador Olexander.
Good evening.
Ambassador, we've known each other for a while now. Since you're coming, I think in 2016, I think we met soon after that, and I've had the pleasure of having your children with us at Sunway. So having known you personally, I would like for the rest of our audience to also know a little bit about you personally. For example, how are you and your family adapting to this situation from a personal point of view? It must be very stressful, and I must say that my family, who knows your family well enough, are concerned and wondering. So would you share a little bit about that with us?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Elizabeth Lee. I really hate the relationship that we cherish since I arrived in 2016. In fact, I'm one of the most senior ambassadors because my term has been already 5.5 years. And of course, our children know Sunway very well, and I want to thank you for all the support that I've been getting for all these past 5 years. So this situation affects everyone in Ukraine, not just our family, but I believe every family. As I mentioned, 11 million people had to flee their homes. 11 million, 7 million within the country, and 4 million had to leave the country. Mostly it's women and children. My own family, although immediate family is here, but the rest of the family is in Ukraine. And of course, my dad and my brother, they're in Kyiv, in the capital. Even during the darkest hours, they refused to leave. And the first week, it was particularly difficult because everybody was glued to watching the news, what's going on, etc., etc. We were trying to get in touch with the family. It was a hard, I would say, and challenging time, but of course, we have to understand that we have a job to do here in Malaysia, and our family, they are back in Ukraine as safe as the rest of Ukrainians. So we hope that the war will be over, and we understand that we have to go through this change to make sure that our country and our people will come out stronger, because these are the values that we are determined to protect. I can share with you some of the things that it is a very common sentiment in Ukraine to protect the homeland. We are on our land, we are in our cities and our villages, and everyone who can pick up the arms, they stand up and fight against the invaders. Those who cannot do that, they help other ways. They do some volunteering in hospitals, some protecting or taking care of the elderly who are left behind. So the whole country, the whole nation is united, and that's absolutely amazing feeling that keeps us going, that keeps us strong, and gives us absolutely undeniable conviction that we're gonna win this fight.
You're a diplomat, and like you said, a very senior one, having been here so long. I can't help wonder, actually, when did the diplomacy, how did the diplomacy sort of take a back seat and the guns came out, in this war? Was there ever any attempt to speak with Russia, and then suddenly this conflict, from conflict to war? Could you tell us a little bit from your point of view?
Ukraine has been always committed to peace. Throughout 1,500 years of our history, Ukraine has never invaded any other sovereign country or nation. However, Ukraine was very often a subject to the foreign invasion from different parts, from different powers and empires. When it comes to the recent, let's say, situation with Russia, Ukraine was a signatory of the Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation with Russia that was signed in 1992. And that treaty is very clear that both countries respect each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We are not the one who started the war. We are not the one who started the conflict, and we never harbor any ill ambitions. In fact, the commitment to peace was enshrined in our constitution and in many international documents that were signed by Ukraine. So in that sense, I believe the fundamental rule of diplomacy, you have to have a genuine commitment to achieve certain goals, certain objectives. What we've seen in the past few months on the Russian side, it was a false diplomacy. We had an unprecedented effort led by international leaders, President Biden of the United States, President Macron of France, German Chancellor Scholz, and many other United Nations Secretary General. A lot of calls on Russia to get serious about, negotiating, about diplomacy. But again, when there is no commitment on the other side, then you can't have it, decided on a table of negotiations. Although even under these unprecedented circumstances, when Ukraine was attacked, our president has been very consistent in saying that we are open for negotiations. We are genuinely committed to achieve peace and to stop the war.
Right. Thank you. I believe that Faisal would like to ask you some questions now, sir.
Hi, Ambassador Nechytaylo. Thank you for joining us on the show tonight. I just have a few questions. You mentioned in your presentation false narratives have been spread. Have you been surprised by the reaction of some Malaysians? Of course, there's a group that's very sympathetic of what's going on in the Ukraine right now. But there's also groups that feel that Russia was antagonized by NATO into acting against the Ukraine. And there's also another group that feels that there's some sort of double standard in the way that the Ukraine is getting support, but a lot of other occupied territories and humanitarian disasters aren't getting the same attention. Are you surprised that there's sort of like a range of different reactions within Malaysia?
I think for any society, for any nation or country, democratic country, it's okay to have different views. When it comes to the false narratives and propaganda, the danger is that they are trying to use misinformation to sow hatred and distrust between people and nations. And if you look at specifically Russian propaganda, it's been a long-lasting process that included interference in the United Nations, in the United States election, presidential elections, in various elections in Europe, etc., etc. So we're talking about the messages that are trying to incite distrust and hatred between different races, different religions, and different nations. So Malaysians react differently, and of course, I'm very grateful to those who offered the support in a practical way, to those who just called me, and I have many friends here of all races, and all of them called me, expressed the support, saying we are praying for you, for your country. So I'm really grateful for that. For those who try to look at the conflict through the prism of comparing how much Ukrainians suffering, bigger or lesser compared to other people's suffering, I think it's not the right approach. We have to look at the core of the issue. And the core of the issue is any human suffering is unacceptable, and especially in the 21st century when the humankind was supposed to consolidate the resources for the development, for the fighting diseases, etc., etc. We just finished, or hopefully finished, with the COVID-19 pandemic. And instead of this, a lot of efforts, a lot of resources, and a lot of human lives being thrown at the stake because one particular person lives in a, I don't know, hallucinated world of the past. So when it comes to the narrative that Russia was somehow provoked by NATO or by somebody else, you have to understand that NATO, Ukraine is not part of NATO. First of all, second of all, when Ukraine became independent, we wanted to become a non-aligned country, independent, neutral country. However, in 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine. And the narrative was that, okay, at that time, they wanted to somehow annex the Crimea under the pretext of some historic rights whatsoever. I mean, the narratives can change. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia, also under the false flag or false pretense reason that it was provoked. It sort of reminds me, if I can compare this to the some of the, let's say, cases when the rape victim was blamed for being a serial rapist. We are talking about the serial, let's say, criminal, which is committing a lot of crimes, and it has a very long history of those crimes committed, and yet we are trying to divert attention by putting a blame on the victim. So I think it's unacceptable, and we have to look at the core of the issue. And the core of the issue, Russia is the aggressor. Russia violated the international law. It's not NATO or it's not Ukraine who attacked Russia, but it is Ukraine who was attacked by Russia. And we lost already, I think, around 4,000 people because of this absolutely unprovoked aggression, infrastructure, refugees, etc., etc. So. It's not right to understand or to try to align yourself with somebody just under the pretext of some kind of false narratives or false information.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ambassador. During your presentation, you also mentioned about this idea of having to choose a side, right? And something that hasn't escaped our attention is a broader trend towards deglobalization, it seems. The Ukraine is very clearly leaning towards the US, NATO, and EU. And it seems like there's another bloc emerging between, say, Russia, China, India. Southeast Asia has traditionally been neutral in these things. I think in the latest UN General Assembly vote, on suspending Russia from the Human Rights Council. I think you saw that within the region, a large number of ASEAN countries decided to abstain. If the conflict were to spread along those lines, where do you see Southeast Asia leaning towards? And I think the broader question that I'm trying to get at is neutrality a realistic, sustainable option for ASEAN?
Depends how you define neutrality. If neutrality means standing on the basic principles and fundamentals of the international law, then I think such neutrality is viable. Malaysia, for instance, has been very consistent in condemning foreign invasions. 1983 in Grenada, I think Afghanistan, Soviet invasion in Afghanistan, invasion in Iraq, invasion in Afghanistan, and invasion into Ukraine. So in that sense, I believe if the country is firmly, let's say, based on the principles of the international law and UN Charter, then that's the cement or the foundation, the strong foundation for the international security system. When it comes to issues like Human Rights Council, many countries may take different stance. But it's okay, again, to have a discussion and to have different views. But in that specific case of Russia, we believe there was all the good reasons for Russia to be suspended for the Human Rights Council, which would eventually happen, because every country that has been elected to be a member of Human Rights Council takes an obligation to uphold the rules and principles of the human rights. And that was obviously not the case. And we were talking about suspension, not the expulsion. Let's say, insist on expulsion Russia from the Human Rights Council because that was the message, so that the investigation could be conducted in the meantime, and Russia should have cooperated with this investigation. However, what happened, and we believe that at this time, Human Rights Council is not the place for Russia.
Speaking of investigations, I think Emma has a few questions about war crimes, so I'll hand over to her. Thanks for that, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So you talked earlier about propaganda and disinformation, and Faisal touched on the range of views that you have in Malaysia. So I just really want to get your opinion on, in terms of on the ground in Ukraine, how do you find the truth about what has actually happened in terms of potential war crimes? How do you sift out the disinformation? Is it possible, do you think, at some stage that the international community, including people in Malaysia, will get to a point where we accept certain common facts, that we will all agree these are the facts and this is disinformation? Do you think that's possible, and how does that work on the ground?
The atrocities that were committed in Bucha, and let me tell you, Bucha is just the tip of the iceberg, because when we liberated other areas, the number of victims and the way they were executed or the way they were treated is quite similar to Bucha. So therefore, it is important to have a thorough and impartial investigation. How it works on the ground so far? We have a task force set up by the Office of the Prosecutor General. So we collect the testimonies of the witnesses who were there when the crimes were committed. This is one part. Second, very important part, the bodies of victims are being subjected to the forensic expertise, and each body is carefully examined in terms of what is the cause of death, when the death happened, etc., etc. So currently, the science and technology allows us pretty accurately to ascertain the reason, the place, and the time of death of individual, and collecting all those evidences. For instance, we talk about Bucha. Only in Bucha, there were 407 bodies recovered. Some were left on the streets for many days. So a lot of data being analyzed, including satellite images that show that those bodies were on the streets of the town for many days, especially during the time when the Russian control of the city. So it's important, based on those evidence, to present the case for the International Tribunal, because International Tribunal is the body that would be trustworthy, that would have the level of confidence from every member of international community. But again, having Russia as the permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, I doubt that they would be supporting the idea of the International Tribunal, just like it happened back in 2015 when Malaysia put forward the resolution on the International Tribunal for MH17 investigation. But that draft was vetoed by Russia. So as long as Russia and the Security Council as a permanent member, I don't think this idea could be feasible. However, it's important, I think it's to have a court, international body to make sure that, those who are guilty, to present all the evidence and to get those guilty prosecuted in the open court. In fact, a lot of things have been analyzed and processed. We identified a lot of Russian soldiers who were committing the crimes, because a lot of records available in the open sources like social media, telephone conversations, etc., etc. So there is a very, how would I say, a thorough effort to make sure that those who committed the crimes and those who ordered the crimes are responsible.
Yep. You mentioned a special tribunal to investigate these war crimes. How will Ukraine get around the Russian problem of blocking such a tribunal? How will you be able to bring that to fruition?
I think this is the matter for further discussion. But if, again, you look previously at the MH17 investigation, when the resolution was blocked in the United Nations Security Council, the grieving countries, Australia, Malaysia, Belgium, Ukraine, we set up the joint investigation team that conducted the investigation, and we agreed that the prosecution will be done according to the Dutch law, because the majority of the victims were holding nationality, Dutch citizenship. So I believe if there is a commitment on behalf of the international community, we will find a way how to do it, how to make it happen.
Okay. I believe Faisal has some more questions, a couple of questions, and then we've got some questions from the audience. So I'll just bring Faisal back in.
Sure. Ambassador, let's sort of look to the future a little bit. What do you think the most likely, realistic, pragmatic way forward might be for Russia and Ukraine?
Oh, wow, that's the question. You see, when you see atrocities in Bucha, when you see atrocities in Mariupol, where the 95% of the buildings were flattened by the indiscriminate fire of artillery, bombings, etc., etc., it's very difficult even to talk about some basic dialogue. Yeah. But again, if you look at the future, we don't choose our neighbors, and sooner or later we'll have to find the algorithm, the modus operandi, how we can coexist. For us, the most important part is that Ukraine will never allow to make our choices for us. And this is the absolutely fundamental value. These are the things why people are so much willing to defend our land and to defend our way of life. For us, anything else can be discussed. The red lines is the territorial integrity and sovereignty of our country. Russia must leave our country and must commit to peaceful coexistence.
Do you think that Putin will do that?
I have serious doubts that he has a genuine desire to uphold peace, not just in terms of Ukraine, but generally in the world. In fact, if you look at his political career and his 20 plus years in office, it's been all connected with certain military campaigns of wars. Chechnya, then Georgia, then Syria, then Ukraine 2014, then Ukraine 2022. So I believe it will be very difficult to achieve peace. But again, you have to look beyond that. We are not talking about some personalities. We are talking about coexistence between two nations, two countries. So let's hope that there will be a common denominator for all of us.
Sure. Ambassador, in your presentation just now, there was a very heavy emphasis on inflation. It seems to me personally that it's Putin's single biggest weapon that he's got in his arsenal, which is even more effective than perhaps the nuclear threat itself. You mentioned how the conflict's contributing to not just inflation, but also a lot of domestic political pressure in Europe, around the world, etc. Do you think there'll come a point where governments might capitulate and let Russia take Ukraine in exchange for lower energy, food prices, political stability?
Whose government will capitulate? Sorry, I mean.
I think we're seeing a lot of pressure in the UK, for example, with rising prices across the board for energy, for food. We are certainly seeing it in Malaysia, as you mentioned before. Commodity prices have been going up, and usually when you look at history, that tends to create a lot of political instability domestically. Do you feel that that may push a lot of countries to just accept Russia taking over the Ukraine, force of habit?
Well, what I can tell you for sure that Ukrainians is not going to give up. We're going to continue our fight because I think we are standing up for the values that are not common just for Ukraine, but also for the rest of the world. So if you talk about the rising price for utilities or the rising price for food, it is a very difficult situation perhaps for somebody, but we are talking about thousands of people getting killed and millions of people being displaced in Ukraine. So Ukraine is the one who's paying a very high price to make sure that the rest of the world will be able to live in peace and in a way how the world should work, mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. Because let me tell you, if Ukraine falls, this period of instability will not end. In fact, the world will become even more violent and turbulent place. So therefore, I think it's in the common interest for the entire humanity that Ukraine will stand up and Ukraine will win in this fight for democracy, for the rule of law.
Sure. I think we've got some questions on the Q&A. Emma's got one on Asia Pacific.
Yeah, so it's kind of linked really from the economic ramifications of this. So in terms, questions come from Roger, who hopes to study Eastern European studies at UCL in London. And his question is, do you think the geopolitical tensions in Eastern Europe will have a negative impact on Asia Pacific security as well?
Yes, absolutely. I'm absolutely certain because again, we are talking about the sanctity of the international law. Once this fundamental is removed, the whole paradigm of peaceful coexistence will be removed. We cannot allow the principle of might is right to be used in the international law. The basic is that every country has similar rights, big or small, no matter what kind of size of economy, no matter the population or area. We're talking about the basic principles of the international law. And if we allow bigger powers to bend the international rules or international law as they see fit, then the whole world will see the impact. When it comes to Asia Pacific, obviously, especially when it comes to South China Sea or any other areas, specific areas in Asia Pacific, this could be a dangerous precedent, and that can have a tremendous impact on many countries, especially smaller ones. If you look at the President Putin's speech before the invasion to Ukraine, he used some specific reasons and some so-called justification why he needed to start this war against Ukraine. He said generally that the creation of Ukraine was the result of the historical errors and crazy decisions, which in itself shows the whole strategy or the whole notion that he denies Ukrainians every right to exist. He denies our country the right to exist. And those atrocities and other places across Ukraine is just the extension of this policy, of this vision that is been dominating in Ukraine for the past, I don't know, more than 15 years. So in that sense, the impact will be global, and unfortunately, even Asia-Pacific region will not be spared.
Ambassador, if I may, I'm glad you brought up that last point. A lot of people believe that the whole reason for Russia invading Ukraine is because Ukraine suddenly said that they will join NATO. And this is what is believed. I suppose there are two questions here. The first one would be, why did Ukraine do that? Because Russia has always made it very clear that Ukraine, just like Finland and some of the other countries, should remain neutral. And the second question would be, would Ukraine actually say, right, we're not going to join NATO. We declare that we won't join NATO. Would Ukraine do that? And would that also immediately stop the conflict?
Ukraine did not suddenly decide to join NATO. Ukraine decided to join the alliance as a response to the security threats that we were facing because of the Russian annexation of Crimea and the proxy war in the southeast of Ukraine. Ukraine in 1991 declared that we would like to become a neutral, non-aligned countries, but non-aligned option didn't work for us. And if you look currently what is happening in Finland or Sweden, now those countries also talking about joining NATO because they understand that neutrality perhaps is not the best option anymore when you have an aggressive neighbor like Russia that can invade, it can ignore international law. So again, you have to understand the specific, the nature of NATO alliance. NATO alliance was created in the middle of 20th century as a collective security system to be where every country has to fulfill some specific criteria. And it's not just a defensive bloc, it's also the bloc that promotes democracy and the rule of law, independent judiciary, etc., etc. So NATO does not impose its membership on any other sovereign country. It's the sovereign choice of every nation to join or to choose the alliance of their choice. And for Ukraine, we have chosen this alliance, joining NATO, as our strategic geopolitical goal, because we believe it's only by achieving or attaining membership in NATO we can make sure that our own security and territorial integrity will be guaranteed. And let me tell you something else. I believe if Ukraine were a member of NATO before the Russian invasion, Russia would never have dared to attack Ukraine. That's absolutely certain. The future, your second question, whether Ukraine will be able or will be willing to give up on our aspiration to join NATO. I think President Zelensky made very clear on many occasions that currently membership of the Union is enshrined in our constitution. We are willing to negotiate peace agreement. We are not interested in ceasefire, but we are looking into achieving the long-lasting comprehensive solution that will allow Ukraine to be certain that the invasion or the war will not repeat itself again. That's why we are willing to negotiate everything. However, the red lines for us is sovereignty and territorial integrity and full withdrawal of Russian forces from the territory of Ukraine. These are the red lines that we are not willing to compromise on.
Ambassador, speaking of red lines, was there a promise, not 1 inch towards the east? Was that something that is historically accepted within Ukraine, or what was that not even on the table at the time?
I think the so-called promise of NATO not to expand eastwards, it's a fantasy and a false narrative that is currently spinned by Russian propaganda. If you look at the source, particularly the memoirs of Mikhail Gorbachev, the president of the Soviet Union, who actually negotiated with Chancellor Kohl at that time and the Western leaders, President Bush, I think President Mitterrand of France. So there was no such promise made. And he made it very clear in his memoirs and his multiple interviews to German and international media. So this is a narrative that was falsely created propaganda to somehow justify or to somehow create some sort of foundation for their claims. We have to look fundamentally at the things. Every country has sovereign choices, has a right to make sovereign choices. No other country can dictate other country to, to choose their alliance whatsoever, or to choose how to live their, lives, how to build their society, how to build their constitution. Try to extrapolate that situation between Ukraine and Russia into this region. If one power suddenly decides to dictate other smaller countries how to change their constitutions, how to treat their, let's say, minorities in other countries, do you think that would be acceptable way of development?
I mean, just one more sort of like red line discussion. So far, the response from the EU and NATO has been sort of like, one toe in the water. They're supplying arms and munitions, etc., to Ukraine, but what Ukraine wants is sort of direct intervention, right? You want planes and troops on the ground, etc., which will undoubtedly escalate the conflict beyond Ukraine. Do you understand why perhaps that some nations are reluctant to sort of go all in, as it were, with Ukraine because of that escalation?
Well, let's try to answer this question, let's say, in few approach. First one, EU does not have troops as such. So European Union is one thing, NATO is the other thing. Second part, Ukraine never asked for NATO direct intervention. We never asked for the troops on the ground. We have requested NATO to provide the air support, which means to close the skies over Ukraine, to protect the skies in Ukraine from Russian airplanes that are bombarding peaceful sea. That was the official request. Then when it comes to the involvement of different countries, we appreciate all the assistance that we get from the individual members of NATO, European Union, and countries beyond NATO. You have to understand that we are getting support from Korea, we are getting support from Japan. So it's not just some kind of, Western or pro-Western continents. We enjoy wide support from the international community. Ukrainians are ready, willing, and that's what we are doing now. We are defending not just our country, we are defending democracy, we are defending the entire world, because I truly believe that if Ukraine falls, it's not going to end there. Tomorrow, Russia may put some other, demands, some requests to the international community, and will try to blackmail the international community in doing something else or this or that. So the escalation is already there, and the world will never be the same. We have to understand that 22nd of February 2022, 24th of February 2022 became the watershed moment. The world will never be the same.
Okay, I just want to bundle up a few questions together. One was from Lucas Appleton, who wanted to know about whether the West had done enough beforehand. And that's kind of linked into something, a question that Mark Disney has, which is about, even if you're previously were pro-Putin or you admired him in some way, he's just gone too far. I mean, David Miliband, the ex-foreign secretary in Britain, talked about this age of impunity, this decade of impunity, and that Putin has pushed and pushed and pushed, and he's got away with it. So you think that he's crossed the line now, and that the West will respond in a way to stop this aggression?
Are you asking, has the Putin crossed the line?
Yes. Do you enough for the West to actually stop him? Because there's, if you listen to people like David Miliband, and he talks about this decade of impunity where there's just been encroachment, and as Lucas said, the West didn't intervene early enough or strongly enough. Do you think now we are at that moment now where intervention needs to be conclusive and stronger?
I believe a lot of governments, a lot of countries are now reviewing their policy towards Russia, and one of the most prominent examples is, Germany has a long-lasting stance of trying to engage Russia into European security, into various projects like gas pipelines, etc. But now they are reviewing this policy, in fact, not just by supporting Ukraine economically or financially, but by supplying the defensive weapons to Ukraine. This is a major turnaround in German foreign policy. I think so too. Same when it comes, for instance, to Japan has been supplying certain items to Ukraine that Japan would never supply under other circumstances. So, of course, the world realized that what is happening in Ukraine has to be stopped, and Ukraine has to be supported with all means possible to make sure that this aggression will not continue, will not go to other places. Some of the most stunning facts I saw about, Russian policy towards general Russian sentiment toward the war. We are trying to understand the Russian mentality from our point of view, from the point of view of the free media, free discussions, etc. But you have to understand that internally, Russians are not at liberty to enjoy the freedom of speech, to enjoy free media, etc. So 71% of Russians support the invasion into Ukraine. This is a stunning number, and one would never believe, but this is the result of the year of Russian propaganda, brainwashing, narratives, etc. What's worse, 75% of Russians support the invasion into Poland, which is NATO. 47% support the attack on the Baltic states, and 37% support the attack on other Central European countries. So we have to talk here about, I think, collective responsibility, or somehow, a collective effort to make sure that propaganda will not poison minds of people in Russia, and how to do that. It's a big question, because NGOs are not allowed to operate in Russia. All political opponents are being expelled out of Russia or being put in prison. So it's a big issue, and I think collectively we have to ensure that access to the independent media, to independent information, will be made available for ordinary Russians.
That's going to link to one of the questions from the audience, from Ashar, who says, how has the invasion of Ukraine by Russia affected the geopolitical atmosphere of Eastern Europe and the relationship between those countries outside, for example, in the Baltic states, in Scandinavia?
I think the invasion, once again, reaffirmed the transatlantic unity. And we are talking not just about unity between the European countries, we are talking about the unity between the transatlantic community, like United States and Canada, etc. You remember in the past 5 years, there were a lot of talks that perhaps NATO is no longer relevant, that a lot of NATO members are not willing to spend a sufficient amount of funds to support the defense capabilities, etc. This invasion turned things around. Now we see unprecedented unity among the countries of European Union, among Central and Eastern European part of the continent, particularly those who are close to Russia, because they understand that the danger is there, and they have to do something, because if you don't do it in advance, then later it can be just late.
Faisal, do you want to ask a question?
I think I'm all right, I think.
Okay. So I'd like to ask a question as a student has posed. Sorry, I just put that on the wrong chat group. Could you clarify the government's official stance on the Azov battalion? Is it parliamentary militia? Is this parliamentary militia part of the Ukrainian army?
Azov is part of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. It was created in 2014 as the result of the volunteers movement. Now, Ukrainian military force, and it takes orders from the chief of the defense force of Ukraine. So now some of those units are protecting Mariupol, and we believe that they showed absolutely astonishing courage and bravery in protecting the city and civilians. So yes, Azov, we believe they are part of our... Just me or is there sound?
Okay, I think it might be you. Okay, it's stopped.
Okay, seems better now.
Sorry. Do you want to just finish that? We lost that last part.
Yeah. So I'm trying to say that Azov is part of Ukrainian regular military force. This is not paramilitary or whatever. These are the fighters. These are the members of Ukrainian military force.
Okay. Elizabeth, do you want to pick up any of the questions?
Well, not so much a questions, but another personal one, sir. How's the communication between you and, HQ, so as to say, are communication links restored? How do you maintain contact?
We have certain protocols in place. Before the invasion, we have been preparing, let's say, certain backup options and backup plans. And I can tell you that the communication is generally not much affected. We have communication on a daily basis. And very often now we have online conferences with Minister of Foreign Affairs, with President, with the Minister of Defense and the Chief of Nation and the National Defense Council. So there are, let's say, technology now allows us to make sure that all of Ukrainian embassies around the world are on the same page and mention of the, let's say, the rest of the countries that are defending itself. So we are fulfilling very important jobs here, while
Yes.
our kids are defending our country back in Ukraine.
Thank you.
Okay, so I've been looking at the questions in the chat. I think they've all been covered, apart from one from Mark Disney, who says, is there a strong argument for dismantling NATO?
I think it's the other way around. There is a strong argument in favor of NATO, because Russia's actions show that no country can feel safe anymore. So, and NATO is probably the only effective, proven mechanism that will allow the collective security of the smaller countries when it comes especially to the nuclear.
Thank you. Conclusive answer. Thank you. So I have a final question, actually. I mean, in your presentation and in the discussion, you've talked about the support that you've had from the Malaysian government and from businesses as well. How can the average Malaysian person show their support for Ukraine?
There are many ways how to support Ukraine. I think, first of all, we can share the information about what is happening, because increasing the awareness of people, what kind of atrocities are taking place, or what kind of crimes being committed in Ukraine is very important to trigger the proper response. And I'm talking not just about moral response, but also about the response when it comes to legal or any other options. The second possible option is to support Ukraine financially. As a result of the invasion, we expect that this year Ukraine may lose 30% of our GDP. Therefore, it's also important to make sure they provide all necessary care to all people who had to flee their life, to flee their homes, to save their lives. Ukrainian government is now supporting 7 million internally displaced persons, and that humanitarian relief efforts requires a lot of, let's say, funds, a lot of different support. So we have opened an account in Malaysia where we accumulate all the donations that are being done here in Malaysia, and later on a weekly basis, those funds been transferred to the humanitarian relief effort in Ukraine. So we also work with the business community here. Malaysian government, allocated $65,000 US through the International Red Cross, Red Crescent Society, for the international relief efforts in Ukraine. So it is a collective effort, and of course, no help is too small. So again, I would like to thank everyone who contributed one way or another, and to say that it feels your prayers, Ukraine feels your support. So thank you very much, Malaysia.
Okay, thank you. And earlier on, you shared a link to that fund, so we'll paste that in the comments in the information about this at the end of the YouTube. So I would just like to finish by thanking you so much for joining us and for sharing. And I really hope that you can come back in better times, and we can talk about all the wonderful things. We didn't have time to talk about all the wonderful things you were doing with Ukrainian-Malaysia relationships before this, and I hope that we do get to that situation again where circumstances are much better. And there's a lot of people who have their hopes and their prayers and their thoughts are with you. So thank you so much. I know you're incredibly busy. Thank you for spending so much time and for being so frank with your comments. We really appreciate that. And as I say, we'll post the link at the bottom. Thank you to Elizabeth and Faisal for co-hosting with me. Thank you to Checo for helping with the questions and the tech, and to Mark, Patrick, and Zamir for the online moderation, and to Liana for comms. And finally, again, thank you to the ambassador for joining us and for being so informative and for being so frank and open with us. And our thoughts and prayers are with you and the Ukrainian community here in Malaysia and also back home.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining us and for your questions online as well. Thank you and good night.